Welcome and good morning. I'm Josh Coyote, today's worship associate. Today is our August 27th, 2023, in-person and online service. Reverend Kevin Carson, Vic Allen, Marty Carson, and Jessica Kuipers bring you this service from our church's sanctuary. So welcome this morning, this day, and this opportunity to be together in community. Our weekly announcements are on Saturday, September 9th, 6 p.m. is the start of our pledge drive for 2024. We'll have a upbeat, upmarket, uplifting party, all members and friends invited. And so this will be a fun family event that will get us in the mood for generous giving. There'll be a potluck supper followed by dancing to music for our pledge drive. So that's Saturday, September 9th, 6 p.m. In Fellowship Hall downstairs, I believe. Yep, okay. We'll be having joys, sorrows, and concerns after the time for all ages. If you're in the service, there's a basket over there to put any in. And also, if you're online, just fill it out in the chat box and mention that it's a joy or concern or sorrow. And now for our sacred time of our service. As I ring the peace bowl 3 times, take deep breaths and relax so we can move into worship. For this moment in time, let go of your anxieties, fears, and worries. Be in this moment. We will now read our church covenant. It is printed in the order of service, so if you like to, feel free to read it along with us. Love is the spirit of this community, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. We'll now be lighting our chalice. We gather this hour as people of faith, with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning, in celebration of the life we share together.
Good morning. Our call to worship this morning is the poem "Touch Not My Lips with a White Fire" by Alfred Storer Cole. Touch not my lips with a white fire from the glowing altar of some peaceful shrine. Thrust not into my hands the scroll of wisdom, gleaned through the patient toil of the centuries. Give me no finished chart that I may follow without effort or the bitter taste of tears. I do not crave the comfort of the ancient creeds, nor the sheltered harbor where the great winds cease to blow. But winnow my heart, O God, torture my mind with doubt. Let me feel the clean gales of the open sea until thy creative life is my life and my joy. One with the miracle of spring and the blowing grain, the yearning of my fellow men, and the endless reach of stars. I invite you now to rise in body or spirit and join in singing our opening hymn, number 361, Enter, Rejoice, and Come In.
Enter, rejoice, and come in. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Open your ears to the song. Open your ears to the song. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Open your hearts, everyone. Open your hearts, everyone. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Don't be afraid of some change. Don't be afraid of some change. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and come in.
This morning I will be sharing with you a book titled Writing the Tiger by Eve Bunting, illustrated with woodcuts by David Frampton. They're dark woodcuts, so I won't show all of them because you might not be able to see them from a distance. I was leaning against the wall of the house when the tiger came. "Hi, Danny," he said. It scared me that he knew my name, but I was pleased, too. "A bit bored?" he asked. "A bit lonely?" I nodded. The tiger cocked his head. "That's the way it is when you're new in town. But we'll fix that. Why don't you hop on my back and we'll take a ride? I stared at him. He purred and rubbed his head against my shoulder. Just a short ride. My back's wide and comfortable, and you've got nothing else to do, have you? Well, I'll help to tell my mom where I'm going. He grinned. If you do, she won't let you. I grinned back. You're right about that. Okay. He crouched so I could get on. My feet hung all the way off the ground, even though my legs are real long, which is why my mom calls me Danny Longlegs. Too bad you're not wearing my colors, the tiger said. Next time. Sure, I said, not even knowing what colors he meant. I held on to the thick, coarse fur at the tiger's neck. Each golden hair glistened. His black bands came together perfectly, like the stripes on a soccer jersey. He smelled of something dark and exciting. Ready? He asked. Ready. How old are you, Dan? 10, I said. Man, I'd have thought older. Up there, high on his back, I did feel big, really big. I wanted to pound my chest and shout, "Look at me, everyone! I'm riding a tiger!" Now, an old man was reading his morning paper on the bench in front of Muto's grocery. When he saw us, he went inside fast. "Stay away from here," he yelled. The tiger turned to look at me. That Muto is nothing but a wimp. His voice was the strangest mixture of every accent I'd ever heard. A police car came cruising down the street. It slowed when the officer saw us. "Hey, kid," one of the officers called. "You're new, aren't you? You don't want to start off by riding that tiger. That's nothing but trouble." "We were just taking a little walk is all," the tiger said quite politely, "to see if we like each other." The officer looked closely at me. Once you get up on the tiger's back, it's hard to get off. But if you get off fast enough, it's still possible. "He doesn't want to get off," the tiger said. "Right, Danny?" I nodded. Right. But the officer and Mr. Muto had made me a bit edgy. I still didn't want to get off for a while. I didn't want the tiger to think I was a wimp, too. The officer shrugged, and the car rolled on. The shops on Center Street were open for business. People moved off the sidewalk so the tiger and I could pass. "This is neat," I whispered, and the tiger said, "Yeah, I always get respect, and whoever was with me gets respect too." Several kids said hi to the tiger and looked enviously at me. One girl touched his striped side, and I felt him bristle. "Can I go with you?" the girl asked. "Not now," the tiger said. "Maybe later. Do you think the way I think?" "Yes." "Do you want what I want?" The girl nodded. "Because anyone who isn't for us is against us," the tiger said. "I'm for you," the girl said. The tiger lifted a paw and laid it on her shoulder. "Come on over then. You know where I'm at." The tiger squinted back at me as we walked. "Questions that have to be asked," he said. "Pretty soon, I'll be asking you." We were passing a playground. A bunch of guys about my age were shooting baskets. They didn't even look up as we passed. The tiger's lope turned to a swagger, which made it hard to stay on his back. "Hey, pal," someone called. "You, on the tiger. Want to get off that beast and come play some ball?" The guy was older than the others. He could have been 18. His bare chest was brown and smooth as a nut. "That's Ferdy," the tiger said. He works at giving kids options." The tiger said options as if it was the dumbest word that ever was. Now, were options the same as choices? I thought so. He says, "There's lots of stuff that's more fun than riding a tiger." The tiger shook his head. I leaned low across his neck. "To tell the truth, I do like basketball. Maybe I will get off here. Thanks for the ride. But maybe I don't want you to get off," the tiger said. "Maybe I want to know you better." My stomach gave a disgusting lurch. "You didn't tell me I couldn't get off whenever I felt like it," I said. "I don't tell everything," he said. "See those walls?" I looked and saw that almost all of the storefronts were covered with black tiger paw prints and words I couldn't understand. The prints were on a McDonald's billboard sign covering the slogan. They were written over the corner stop sign. "That means we're in tiger territory," the tiger said. "Mine. Be honored you're with me." But I wasn't honored anymore. I had to get off, here, where Ferdy was still watching and might help me. I brought my left leg up so I could slip down the tiger's side. "Don't even think about it," the tiger said, and when he turned, I could see the yellow glitter of his eyes. I eased my leg back to where it had been before. He was walking faster now, and the ground seemed further away. Had he grown bigger? Had I grown smaller? His paws made no sound. We flowed along in absolute silence. Now there was a street jammed with traffic. Sometimes the tiger held up a paw so we could pass. One van driver didn't get out of his way fast enough. "Move it," the tiger snarled, and I heard the screech of something sharp digging into metal and saw where he'd raked the red paint off the van with his open claws. "Oh man," I thought, "that driver is going to tear us apart." But he just rolled up his window and turned his head away. His shoulders were hunched up around his ears. "Now that's respect," the tiger said. But I knew right then it wasn't respect. It was something very different. A Metro line bus was moving slowly in front of us. What if I jumped for the step? But what if the driver wouldn't open the door? What if he turned his head away like the guy in the van? I didn't know where we were now, padding through dark alleys, past rundown warehouses and loading docks. A dog mooched away from us, its tail down. A scattering of big crows cawed angrily and flopped up onto a broken wall. There was a homeless man rooting through a garbage can. When he saw us, he began edging backward, but he edged too far, stepping behind him where there was only empty space. I saw him fall. I heard the thud as he landed, heard the quiet. The tiger turned to grin at me and walked on. "Hey, wait!" I jerked at his neck fur. "The man's hurt. He needs help." I swung both legs down and hung, still clinging to the tiger's back. "Stay where you are," the tiger said. What if I didn't? What would he do to me? I heard his breathing dark and deadly, and I heard a small whimper that could have been a cat, but wasn't. It came from the man who'd fallen, too scared to make a noise and in too much pain to keep quiet. I hung halfway on and halfway off the tiger, and I knew I had an option, which was the same as a choice. I glanced down. The ground was so far below me. Once you get up on the tiger's back, it's hard to get off. But if you get off fast, I dropped. The concrete hit me like a pile driver. I fell over, stood again, dazed. Every bit of me hurt. The tiger was in the shadow of one of the old buildings, a black giant of a creature. His tail moved gently. I was trembling all over. You've had your chance. You'll never be one of us now, the tiger said. Don't come whining and begging to me when you need help. You're all alone now, kid. I licked my lips. Maybe. Then I was limping backward, waiting for the tiger to pounce, ready to run, jump, climb. But this was a tiger. How could I outpace him? I risked turning my back on him, glancing down. The man lay at the bottom of crumbled steps, among empty bottles and candy wrappers. When he saw me, he shielded himself with his arms. It's okay, I said. I'm not with him. And when I looked back, there were only 3 crows strutting again in the alley and the dog nosing a cardboard box. The tiger had gone. And we will now proceed to our celebration of joys and concerns.
Okay, this is a very special time in our congregation where each of us has an opportunity to share major events in our lives, our joys, our concerns, and our sorrows, so we can all be uplifted by our UU community. As I read the sorrows, concerns, and joys that were given us, the minister will light a candle. I have a joy from Roby Cartmel. Bob and Roby Cartmel are taking a trip east to Ohio and New Jersey to see friends and family for the first time in years. I have a concern from Victoria. Arthur's health is concerning, and she hopes he will recover easily and soon. And a joy from Victoria. The rain is wonderful. Many thanks to whomever is responsible. We light one more. Oh, are there any?
Yeah, we've got from Arthur. He had a retinal detachment last week, which was reattached last Tuesday. But he says the healing's going to take a little time, and he also has stenosis in his lower back, getting some steroid shots to treat that. But again, that's going to take time, and he's struggling to walk without his trekking poles. So good wishes go out to Arthur, and hope he recovers quickly.
We light one more candle for all the sorrows, concerns, and joys we hold in our hearts and are not ready to share at this time. Know we lift up our love for you, and we are all in this together.
Our reading this morning is from a sermon titled New Wine and Old Bottles by the Reverend Brainerd F. Gibbons, who was a Universalist minister, and this was given in 1949. While fully aware of its Christian heritage, many equally sincere Universalists maintain that an inherent spirit of inquiry has carried Universalism beyond Christianity. A new type of Universalism is proclaimed which shifts the emphasis on universal salvation from salvation to religion, and describes Universalism as boundless in scope, as broad as humanity, and as infinite as the universe. Is this universalism's answer a religion not exclusively Christian or any other named brand, but a synthesis of all religious knowledge which passes the test of human intelligence, a truly universal religion? Every universalist realizes that universalism has changed considerably since the days of its New England forebears, and many Christian dogmas have been gradually supplanted. Even the sketchiest summary reveals the vast differences between then and now. Divine revelation has been replaced by human investigation, ignorance by knowledge, superstition by reason, the closed mind by the open, stagnation by progress, celestial nonsense by common sense. Hence, universalists today consider all religions, including Christianity, expressions of human spiritual aspirations, not God-founded institutions. The Bible, a marvelous work of man, not the miraculous handiwork of God. Jesus, a spiritual leader, not a divine savior. Man's fate in human hands, not supernatural clutches. Faith, the projection of known facts into the unknown, not blind creedal acceptance. The supernatural, merely the natural beyond man's present understanding, not a violation of nature's laws. An offering to support the mission of this church will now be given and gratefully received. Three-part sermon series on the story of our faith. I talked about some of the key players and events during the bloody period of religious turmoil in Europe that marked the 15th through the 17th centuries. The Protestant Reformation was not a singular event. Rather, it was a diverse and prolonged period of upheaval and religious innovation, with many people being executed for simply having beliefs outside the often shifting mainstream. In the middle of all this, one of the most pivotal moments in world history occurred when Columbus sailed across the Atlantic Ocean and landed in the so-called New World. And this is where we begin today. Historians can debate whether Columbus truly discovered America, but what is undeniable is that his arrival began a period of unprecedented European colonization of North and South America, and an equally unprecedented period of devastation for the indigenous peoples who lived here first. It is believed that at the time of European contact, the Americas were populated with as many as 15 million people, making up roughly 500 First Nations. And like all people, they had religious practices and spiritual beliefs. But since their spirituality was more nature-oriented and interwoven with the routines of daily existence, few Europeans who arrived during the first few centuries of contact recognized anything they could identify as, quote, religion based on their own experience. Coming from the old world with its grand cathedrals and parish churches, to European eyes, there were almost no identifiable religious centers beyond a few temples in Mesoamerica and the eastern mounds of the Mississippian culture, the earthen mounds of the Mississippian culture, and nothing in the New World resembled the corporate worship common to Christianity and the other Abrahamic faiths. The prevailing attitude was that Native Americans were simply a bunch of godless heathens who needed to be converted for their own good. Very few people who came to these shores as settlers could appreciate Native American spirituality, and even Unitarian Universalists only began to explore the value and rich sources of indigenous spirituality in earnest in the last decades of the 20th century. As colonists began to arrive, the dominant religion in each colony reflected their country of origin, and sometimes the benefactors of the settlement. Catholicism came along with the Spanish, the French, and the Portuguese, and reformed Protestantism with the Dutch. The English were split mostly between Anglicanism in places like Virginia and Puritanism in New England, with a few other Protestant sects eventually joining the mix. Some colonies, like Plymouth, had a strong religious identity and a sense of purpose, while others were primarily focused on commerce with little interest in religion. Within a couple of centuries after Columbus, America was already becoming a religiously diverse place, at least with respect to varieties of Christianity, and many dissidents from the old world, such as Quakers and Anabaptists, sought refuge in America, hoping to find a more tolerant atmosphere, or at least enough room to escape into the wilderness and be left alone. The Unitarian story in America really begins with the Puritan churches in New England, despite the severe Calvinist theology that dominated the early churches. The Puritans who settled in New England were either separating Puritans, like those who founded the Plymouth colony, or non-separating, like most of the Massachusetts-based settlers. Separating Puritans believed there was no hope for reforming the Church of England, while non-separating Puritans still held out hope that the Church of England could be purged of its corruption and a pure, original Christianity could be restored. Neither group had any use for other religious sects of any stripe. If you thought they would be more tolerant after years of persecution in Europe, you would be wrong. I think it would be fair to compare Puritan New England to Taliban Afghanistan or perhaps modern Saudi Arabia. Setting aside the craziness of the witch trials, just consider the hanging of Mary Dyer on the Boston Common in 1660. She was banned from the colony for being a Quaker, and when she kept coming back, they hanged her. She was one of 4 Quakers hanged in Boston. Or consider the case of Roger Williams, once admired as a brilliant young Puritan minister and offered the pulpit of Boston's first church. He was about to be clapped in irons and sent back to England for probable execution for the crime of spreading, quote, new and dangerous ideas that included liberty of conscience about religion. When he escaped to live among his Narragansett Indian friends and eventually founded the colony of Rhode Island. Theologically, the Puritans believed in the Calvinist doctrine of predestination, the idea that only the elect chosen by God would be saved, and there was nothing you could do about it. You could tell who was among the elect by their godliness, of course. So Puritans obsessed over whether or not they were truly among the chosen. One of the signs was to have a genuine conversion experience, and the first churches required public testimony of such for membership. We have long abandoned that theology, but one thing we retained from the Puritan churches was their congregational polity. Polity refers to how churches are governed, and unlike churches with an episcopal polity, which means governance by bishops, or a Presbyterian polity, which means governance by elders, The Puritan churches were considered independent congregations and were free to call whom they pleased to serve as ministers. This is still the case with UU congregations today, of course. The other aspect of congregational polity that still haunts us, for better or worse, is a fear and loathing of anything that resembles ecclesiastical authority. The Puritan churches were wary of churches or even local ministers forming any kind of association or partnerships, lest they fall prey to the temptation to become hierarchical. Fortunately, in 1648, they managed to come together just enough to create the Cambridge Platform, which is a document that served as an early constitution outlining the polity of churches and civil government of New England, and establishing a mutual support network for the Congregationalist churches. Going forward, I will use the term Congregationalist to describe the churches that would become the ancestors of congregations that are now either Unitarian Universalist or United Church of Christ, and a rare few that are both. Over the next 100 years, two major influences helped shape the trajectory of the Congregationalist churches in New England. One was the Enlightenment, which produced the scientific method and new philosophical thinking. The other was a period of spiritual revival and evangelical zeal in the 1730s and 40s, known as the Great Awakening, when the individual emotional experience of religion, often called enthusiasm in those days, was seen as more important than doctrine. In 1741, for example, Jonathan Edwards preached the famous sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," in Enfield, Connecticut. His sermon reinforced Calvinist doctrine about the sinful nature of humanity and salvation through grace alone, but he did so with imagery and language that touched on deep emotions. In one of his metaphors, he described, quote, "the God that holds you over the pit of hell much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire." Then, as now, such religious emotionalism was not to everyone's taste. And one of the fiercest critics of the Great Awakening was the Reverend Charles Chauncey of Boston's First Church, who in 1742 wrote a pamphlet called "Enthusiasm Described and Cautioned Against." He was the leader of the so-called Old Lights, who rejected enthusiasm in religion. Heavily influenced by the intellectual rationalism of the Enlightenment, he later published two anonymous tracts, "Salvation for All Men" in 1782 and "The Mystery Hid from Ages and Generations" in 1784, arguing for the innate moral sense in man, free will, and universal salvation. The latter tract was published 2 decades after he finished it, since his logical conclusions led him away from the orthodox Calvinist views he continued to preach publicly. He is considered by many to be a proto-Unitarian or even a proto-UU. By the early 1800s, a number of Congregationalist ministers were beginning to preach Unitarian ideas, and a split between them and the Trinitarian orthodoxy was becoming inevitable, especially among the faculty and students at Harvard Divinity School. There was also an influx of European Unitarian ideas from publications and from people like Joseph Priestley, who immigrated to America in 1794 and settled around Philadelphia. Already a familiar figure to the likes of Benjamin Franklin, Benjamin Rush, and Thomas Jefferson, who shared a common interest in science and theology, Priestley helped further the spread of both Unitarian and Universalist ideas in America. By the 1820s, Unitarian and Trinitarian congregations across New England were beginning to split apart, with one group often starting a new church just down the street or across the town green. In 1825, Unitarian-leaning ministers formed the American Unitarian Association, which was originally a ministers' association but was later evolved to become a Unitarian denomination. And before I continue with the Unitarians, let me back up and catch up on the Universalist side of our history. Universalist ideas developed in small pockets among several colonial religious sects, including some Baptists and the Ephrata community of Pennsylvania. But there was a tremendous boost when John Murray arrived in America in 1770, settling in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and founding the first Universalist church in America there in 1774. The story of his personal tragedies and arrival in America is truly remarkable. And I spoke about this in my sermon this past June titled Two Fathers of Unitarian Universalism. If you haven't heard it, check it out on our YouTube channel. For founding the Gloucester Church and for his work organizing the denomination into the Universalist Church of America, which held its first General Assembly in 1793 in Philadelphia, he is often called the father of universalism in America, and I think this is an appropriate honor. With its hopeful message of God's inexhaustible love and universal salvation, the Universalist Church in America attracted many converts away from the prevailing dismal Calvinist theology in the colonies. And after the Revolution, it would experience a prodigious growth and church planting period, especially in rural America. Universalist ministers spread out on horseback from the deep south to the backwoods of New England. And by the onset of the Civil War, there were perhaps as many as 600,000 Universalists in America. The Universalists established churches in many small farming communities in the eastern states, while the Unitarians were mainly focused on larger towns and the growing urban population in cities. Though merger was still over a century away, even in the first decades of the 1800s, most Universalist ministers were also Unitarian in their theology. Many Unitarian clergy, though, saw Universalism as less intellectually vigorous and irrational, and were frankly very classist in their opinions. The famous Unitarian minister William Ellery Channing, whose 1819 sermon, Unitarian Christianity, helped give identity to the Unitarian movement, once described the growth of Universalism as, quote, the most threatening moral evil in our part of the country. Perhaps it was just jealousy at their success. As the 19th century progressed, both of our ancestral denominations were influenced by the new era of biblical criticism coming largely from German scholars, and clergy and laity alike began to explore translations of Eastern religious texts such as the Bhagavad Gita and the Sutras of Buddhism. And nascent humanism was already creeping into the mix as well. All of these would combine with the transcendentalist movement that emerged from Concord and Boston intellectuals such as Emerson, Thoreau, and Margaret Fuller, and things would never be the same. The corpse-cold Unitarianism that Emerson derided would become more open to nature and the direct experience of the sacred, and less focused on establishing some ultra-rational form of Christianity. Universalists, too, would feel the influence of these trends and begin a march toward a more pluralistic faith beyond the boundaries of Christianity. In 1852, feeling that too much authority was coming out of Boston, sound familiar? Unitarians in the Midwestern states formed the Western Unitarian Conference, and Chicago became an intellectual hub for very progressive theology for more than a century afterward. With the publication of Darwin's On the Origin of Species in 1859, both Unitarians and Universalists began to embrace an even stronger scientific humanism, and with a few notable exceptions, began to drift away from more traditional Christianity. By 1886, the trend was so strong that more conservative Unitarians grew alarmed, and over the next few years, the Western Conference in particular debated the need to reassert a definitive Christian identity. A consensus was never reached, despite several attempts at statements of faith. In 1893, Unitarians and Universalists were instrumental in sponsoring the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago, which was a watershed moment for opening the eyes of Americans to the richness of other religions. The highlight of the Parliament was the introduction of Hinduism to America through the charismatic figure Swami Vivekananda. For Universalists, the Parliament was indicative of a growing interest in world religions and the universality of religious truth. They, too, were beginning to wrestle with the question of how distinctively Christian their denomination remained. By the turn of the 20th century, the number of Universalists had shrunk significantly, and there were open talks of merger with either the Unitarians or the Congregationalists and some other small Christian denomination, or with the Congregationalists and other small Christian denominations that would eventually merge to form the United Church of Christ. The First World War was difficult too, as Universalists lost some of their pre-war optimism about the progress of humankind onward and upward forever in the wake of millions of deaths in Europe and the horrifying advances in ways to mutilate and kill that the war produced. Unitarians were divided in their support for the First World War, and the American Unitarian Association came down hard on ministers and congregations who voiced pacifist beliefs at a time of fervent patriotism. Universalist decline and further talks of merger continued between the wars. Humanism gained a tremendous influence in the wake of the first Humanist Manifesto in 1933, which was a document that outlined the basic tenets of religious humanism. It was a remarkable document crafted by many elite thinkers of the age that called for a new science-based religion of human ethics and morality to supplant all other religions, and it viewed any form of supernaturalism with disdain. Most of the 35 signers of the Humanist Manifesto were Unitarian ministers or scholars, and one was a Universalist minister. What strikes me about the original manifesto, there have been two others since, is that the language is rather arrogant and seems to me to reflect an overly naive faith in science and technology. But this was the age of electrification and faith in new pesticides and herbicides that would allow us to feed the world. This was also the age of eugenics, when many people, including some leading Unitarians, thought we could breed a better humanity through science and eliminate undesirable traits like mental illness and criminal behavior. Humanism would remain the dominant influencer in our tradition through the present time. But after the atrocities of the Second World War and the environmental movement afterward, most of the blind faith in science and technology for our salvation has been rightfully tempered. By the 1940s, Unitarian and Universalist groups were regularly meeting together, and in some ways they led us further along the path to consolidation. In 1957, several small denominations merged to form the United Church of Christ. And by this point, the Universalists had become too humanist and too liberal to be realistically joining them. Being snubbed for membership by the National Council of Churches twice, once in 1942 and 1944, for not being, quote, Christian enough, was probably the final blow. Universalist membership declined to its lowest point. Unlike the Unitarians, who were seeing a post-war boom from 350 churches and around 60,000 members at the end of World War II to 1,000 churches and over 150,000 members by the merger in 1961. This congregation was one of those new post-war Unitarian churches founded on April 7th, 1954. The original name was the First Unitarian Fellowship of Southeast Idaho. For many Universalists, the greatest fear was that the merger would see their historic identity swallowed up by their much larger cousin. Other Universalists worried that too much head would take over the more heart tradition of Universalism. Both fears were justified in hindsight. On the Unitarian side, some of the far left opposed the consolidation for fear that the Universalists would drag the movement back to more conservative theological views, but this never came to pass. In 1953, a joint commission to study federal union was appointed, and that same year, the youth groups of both denominations were formally dissolved and merged into the Liberal Religious Youth. The following year, the Council of Churches of the Council of Liberal Churches, Universalist Unitarian, was formed to continue the process of consolidation. From this latter group, a joint merger commission was formed, and in 1958, they presented a proposal to both denominations titled Merger and Alternatives. In this document, two basic alternatives were put on the table for consideration: complete merger of the two denominations, or an expanded Council of Liberal Churches. Approximately 3/4 of the congregations voted for the merger. So a more detailed plan for consolidation was developed in time for the 1959 annual General Assemblies of both denominations. The plan retained the congregational polity and autonomy common to both traditions, as well as the non-creedal basis for membership. In final negotiations that grew intense at times, the name Unitarian Universalist Association was affirmed. The plan proceeded forward, and on May 23, 1960 in Boston, delegates from the two denominations met in separate simultaneous General Assemblies and approved the merger. The Unitarian Universalist Association would officially come into being in May 1961 at the next General Assembly. So here we are, and we continue to evolve. Even as I speak, our movement is wrestling with fundamental revisions to our bylaws with respect to the language that describes our 7 principles. On the cover of your order of service is a graphical representation of the current draft of the re-articulated values of our faith centered on love. There is more information about the work of the Article 2 Study Commission, which is overseeing the process with you on the UUA website if you want to learn more about these changes. At the next General Assembly in June 2024, there will be a further opportunity for revision and a final vote on the changes. We call our faith the living tradition, and this is a great example of how we are not bound by the past, but evolve in a changing world. When I decided to tell our story over the course of 3 sermons, I knew it would be a challenge to choose the key events to form a narrative that does our faith justice. We are a tradition with an incredible history and so many fascinating lives to explore, so many individual stories of triumph and tragedy. And though we should be proud of our record on issues like women in ministry, civil rights, and LGBTQ acceptance, there were also missed opportunities when Unitarians and Universalists could have shone even brighter, but instead succumbed to the endemic sexism, racism, classism, and other moral failures that have plagued American society since the beginning. Too many Unitarian Universalists are unaware of the complexity of our story, and they think that our faith, like the old joke says, is a matter of believing in the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, and the neighborhood of Boston. Or as I like to say, Unitarian Universalism was not handed down on stone tablets to Thoreau on some craggy New England summit, nor did it spring fully formed from the side of Emerson's head like some Greek goddess. It is a faith rooted in reason, and as well as the direct experience of the sacred. And it took a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to become the diverse liberal tradition we are today. I want us to boldly claim the whole story of our faith. We represent what the theologian Wilfred Cantwell Smith called a cumulative tradition. There are many streams that float into the river of our story, and I have only touched on a handful. Every few years, someone comes along with a book pronouncing the death of organized religion, and well, something comes along that reinvigorates it. Despite the many documented benefits of belonging to a church community, it is well known that organized religion is in decline overall, with the demographic group, spiritual but not religious, seeing the largest growth in recent years. Unitarian Universalism has seen essentially flat growth as a denomination, with some parts of the country seeing some modest growth. But I remain hopeful that our diversity and inclusiveness will align well with the attitudes of modern spiritual seekers. What I am more certain about goes back to the very beginning of my first sermon in this series. The impulse to spirituality and religion is fundamental to being human. As long as we are able to experience awe and wonder in the world and enjoy the support of being in a community of fellow travelers in the mysterious journey of existence, our story will continue. I invite you now to rise and body your spirit once again and join in singing our closing hymn, number 113, Where is Our Holy Church?
Where is our holy church, where race and class unite, as equal persons in the search for beauty, truth, and right? Where is our holy writ, where a human heart a sacred torch of truth has lit, by inspiration taught? Where is our Holy One? A mighty host respond. The people rise in every land to break the captive's bond. Where is our Holy Land? Within the human soul, wherever free minds truly seek with character the goal. Where is our paradise? In aspiration's sight, wherein we hope to see arise 10,000 years of right.
Our closing words come from Olympia Brown. Stand by this faith, work for it, and sacrifice for it. There is nothing in all the world so important as to be loyal to this faith which has placed before us the loftiest ideals, which has comforted us in sorrow, strengthened us for noble duty, and made the world beautiful. Do not demand immediate results, but rejoice that we are worthy to be entrusted with this great message, that you are strong enough to work for a great true principle without counting the cost. Go on finding ever new applications of these truths and new enjoyments in their contemplation.
We'll now extinguish the chalice with the words of Elizabeth Sell Jones. Please join me in reading them. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.